Chapter 8. How Don Quixote arrived at an inn, which he imagined to be a castle, and there cured himself and Sancho with the balsam of fierebra. For some time after the Inguesian carriers had gone on their way, Don Quixote and Sancho Panza lay on the ground, groaning and saying nothing. The first that came to himself was Sancho Panza, who cried in a weak and pitiful voice, "Sir Don Quixote, oh, Sir Don Quixote." "What wouldst thou, brother Sancho?" answered Don Quixote in the same faint and grievous tone as Sancho. "I would, if it were possible," said Sancho Panza, "that your worship should give me a couple of mouthfuls of that balsam of fierebra, if so be that your worship has it at hand. Perhaps it will be as good for broken bones as for wounds." "If I had it here," sighed Don Quixote, "we should lack nothing, but I swear to thee, Sancho Panza, on the faith of a knight-errant, that before 2 days pass, unless fortune forbids, I will have it in my possession." "I pray you," asked Sancho, "in how many days do you think we shall be able to move our feet?" "I cannot say," said the battered knight, "but I take on myself the blame of all, for I should not have drawn my sword against men that are not knights. Therefore, brother Sancho, take heed of what I tell thee, for it mightily concerns the welfare of us both. And it is this, that when thou seest such rabble offer us any wrong, wait not for me to draw sword upon them, for I will not do it in any wise, but put thou thy hand to thy sword, and chastise them at thy pleasure." But Sancho Panza did not much relish his master's advice, and replied, "Sir, I am a peaceable, sober, and quiet man, and can let pass any injury whatever, for I have a wife and children to take care of. Therefore, let me also say a word to your worship, that by no manner of means shall I put hand to sword either against clown or against knight. And from this time forth I forgive whatever insults are paid to me, whether they are or shall be paid by persons high or low, rich or poor, gentle or simple." On hearing this, his master said, "Would that I had breath enough to be able to speak easily, and that the pain I feel in this rib were less, that I might make thee understand, Sancho, the mistake thou art making. How can I appoint thee governor of an island when thou wouldst make an end of all by having neither valor nor will to defend thy lands or revenge thine injuries?" "Alas," groaned Sancho, "I would that I had the courage and understanding of which your worship speaks, but in truth, at this moment, I'm more fit for plasters than preachments. See if your worship can rise, and we will help Rocinante, although he deserves it not, for he was the chief cause of all this mauling." "Fortune always leaves one door open in disasters, and your Dapple will now be able to supply the want of Rocinante, and carry me hence to some castle where I may be healed of my wounds. Nor shall I esteem such riding a dishonour, for I remember to have read that old Silenus, tutor and guide of the merry god of laughter, when he entered the city of 100 gates, rode very pleasantly, mounted on a handsome ass." "That may be," replied Sancho, "but there is a difference between riding a horseback and being laid athwart like a sack of rubbish." "Have done with your replies," exclaimed Don Quixote, "and rise as well as thou art able, and sit me on top of thine ass, and let us depart hence before the night comes and overtakes us in this wilderness." Then Sancho, with 30 groans and 6 sighs and 120 curses, lifted up Rocinante, who, if he had a tongue, would have complained louder than Sancho himself, and after much trouble set Don Quixote on the ass. Then, tying Rocinante to his tail, he led the ass by the halter and proceeded as best he could to where the high road seemed to lie. And fortune, which had guided their affairs from good to better, led him on to a road on which he spied an inn, which to his annoyance and Don Quixote's joy must needs be a castle. Sancho professed that it was an inn, and his master that it was a castle, and their dispute lasted so long that they had time to arrive there before it was finished. And into this inn, or castle, Sancho entered without more parley with all his team. The innkeeper, seeing Don Quixote laid athwart of the ass, asked Sancho what ailed him. Sancho answered that it was nothing, only that he had fallen down from a rock and had bruised his ribs somewhat. The innkeeper's wife was by nature charitable, and she felt for the sufferings of others, so she hastened at once to attend to Don Quixote, and made her daughter, a comely young maiden, help her in taking care of her guest. There was also serving in the inn an Asturian wench, broad-cheeked, flat-pated, with a snub nose, blind of one eye, and the other not very sound. This young woman, who was called Maritornes, assisted the daughter, and the two made up a bed for Don Quixote in a garret which had served for many years as a straw loft. The bed on which they placed him was made of 4 roughly planed boards on 2 unequal trestles, a mattress which in thinness might have been a quilt, so full of pellets that if they had not through the holes shown themselves to be wool, they would to the touch seem to be pebbles. There was a pair of sheets made of target leather, and as for the coverlet, if any one had chosen to count the threads of it, he could not have missed one in the reckoning. On this miserable bed did Don Quixote lie, and presently the hostess and her daughter plastered him over from head to foot, Maritornes holding the candle for them. While she was plastering him, the hostess, seeing that he was in places black and blue, said that it looked more like blows than a fall. Sancho, however, declared that they were not blows, but that the rock had many sharp points, and each one had left a mark. And he added, "Pray, good mistress, spare some of that toe, as my back pains are not a little." "In that case," said the hostess, "you must have fallen too." "I did not fall," said Sancho Panza, "but with the sudden fright I took on seeing my master fall, my body aches as if they had given me 1,000 blows, and I now find myself with only a few bruises less than my master, Don Quixote." "What is this gentleman's name?" asked Maritornes. "Don Quixote of the Mancha," answered Sancho Panza, "and he is a knight-errant, and one of the best and strongest that has been seen in the world these many ages." "What is a knight-errant?" asked the wench. "Art thou so young in the world that thou knowest it not?" answered Sancho Panza. "Know then, sister mine, that a knight-errant is a thing which in 2 words is found cudgelled and an emperor. Today he is the most miserable creature in the world, and the most needy. Tomorrow he will have 2 or 3 crowns of kingdoms to give to his squire." "How is it then," said the hostess, "that thou hast not gotten at least an earldom, seeing thou art squire to this good knight?" "It is early yet," replied Sancho, "for it is but a month since we set out on our adventures. But believe me, if my master Don Quixote gets well of his wounds, or his fall, I should say, I would not sell my hopes for the best title in Spain." To all this Don Quixote listened very attentively, and sitting up in his bed, as well as he could, he took the hostess's hand and said, "Believe me, beautiful lady, that you may count yourself fortunate in having entertained me in this your castle. My squire will inform you who I am, for self-praise is no recommendation. Only this I say, that I will keep eternally written in memory the service you have done me, and I will be grateful to you as long as my life shall endure." The hostess, her daughter, and the good Maritornes remained confounded on hearing the words of the knight-errant, which they understood as well as if he had spoken in Greek, but yet they believed they were words of compliment, and so they thanked him for his courtesy and departed, leaving Sancho and his master for the night. There happened to be lodging in the inn that night one of the officers of the Holy Brotherhood of Toledo, whose duty was to travel the roads and inquire into cases of highway robbery. He, hearing some time later that a man was lying in the house sorely wounded, must needs go and make an examination of the matter. He therefore lighted his lamp and made his way to Don Quixote's garret. As soon as Sancho Panza saw him enter, arrayed in a shirt and a nightcap, with the lamp in his hand, which showed him to be a very ugly man, he asked his master, "Will this by chance be some wizard Moor come to torment us?" "A wizard it cannot be," said Don Quixote, "for those under enchantment never let themselves be seen." The officer could make nothing of their talk, and came up to Don Quixote, who lay face upwards encased in his plasters. "Well," said the officer roughly, "how goes it, my good fellow?" "I would speak more politely if I were you," answered Don Quixote. "Is it the custom in this country, lout, to speak in that way to a knight-errant?" The officer, finding himself thus rudely addressed, could not endure it, and lifting up the lamp, oil and all, gave Don Quixote such a blow on the pate with it that he broke his head in one or two places, and, leaving all in darkness, left the room. "Ah," groaned Sancho, "this is indeed the wizard Moor, and he must be keeping his treasures for others, and for us nothing but blows." "It is ever so," replied Don Quixote, "and we must take no notice of these things of enchantment, nor must we be angry or vexed with them, for since they are invisible, there is no one on whom to take revenge. Rise, Sancho, if thou canst, and call the constable of this fortress, and try to get him to give me a little wine, oil, salt, and rosemary, to prepare the health-giving balsam of which I have grievous need, for there comes much blood from the wound which the phantom hath given me." Sancho arose, not without aching bones, and crept in the dark to where the innkeeper was, and said to him, "My lord constable, do us the favour and courtesy to give me a little rosemary, oil, wine, and salt, to cure one of the best knights-errant in the world, who lies yonder in bed, sorely wounded at the hands of a Moorish enchanter." When the innkeeper heard this, he took Sancho Panza for a man out of his wits, but nevertheless gave him what he wanted, and Sancho carried it to Don Quixote. His master was lying with his hands to his head, groaning with pain from the blows of the lamp, which, however, had only raised 2 big lumps, what he thought was blood being only the perspiration running down his face. He now took the things Sancho had brought, of which he made a compound, mixing them together and boiling them a good while until they came to perfection. Then he asked for a phial into which to pour this precious liquor, but as there was not one to be had in the inn, he decided to pour it into a tin oil vessel which the innkeeper had given him. This being done, he at once made an experiment on himself of the virtue of this precious balsam, as he imagined it to be, and drank off a whole quart of what was left in the boiling pot. The only result of this was that it made him very sick indeed, as well as it might, and what with the sickness and the bruising and the weariness of body, he fell fast asleep for several hours, and at the end of his sleep awoke so refreshed and so much the better of his bruises that he took himself to be cured, and verily believed that he had hit upon the balsam of Ferebra. Sancho Panza, to whom his master's recovery seemed little short of a miracle, begged that he might have what was left in the boiling pot, which was no small quantity. Don Quixote consenting, he took the pot in both hands and tossed it down, swallowing very little less than his master had done. As it happened, however, that Sancho's stomach was not so delicate as his master's, and he suffered such terrible pains and misery before he was sick that he thought his last hour was come, and cursed the balsam and the thief who had given it to him. Don Quixote, seeing him in this bad way, said, "I believe, Sancho, that all this evil befalleth thee because thou art not dubbed knight. For I am persuaded that this balsam may not benefit anyone that is not." "If your worship knew that," replied poor Sancho, "bad luck to me and mine. Why did you let me taste it?" Before Don Quixote could reply to this, Sancho became so terribly sick that he could only lie groaning and moaning for 2 hours, at the end of which he felt so shaken and shattered that he could scarcely stand, and sadly wished that he had never become squire to a knight-errant. Chapter 9. How Sancho paid the reckoning at the inn which Don Quixote supposed was a castle. Now, while Sancho Panza lay groaning in his bed, Don Quixote, who, as we have said, felt somewhat eased and cured, made up his mind to set off in search of new adventures, and full of this desire, he himself saddled Rocinante, and put the pack-saddle on his squire's beast, and helped Sancho to dress and to mount his ass. Then getting a horseback, he rode over to the corner of the inn and seized hold of a pike which stood there, to make it serve him instead of a lance. All the people that were staying at the inn, some 20 in number, stood staring at him, and among these was the innkeeper's daughter. Don Quixote kept turning his eyes towards her and sighing dolefully, which every one, or at least all who had seen him the night before, thought must be caused by the pain he was in from his bruises. When they were both mounted and standing by the inn gate, he called to the innkeeper and said in a grave voice, "Many and great are the favours, Sir Constable, which I have received in this your castle, and I shall remain deeply grateful for them all the days of my life. If I am able to repay you by avenging you on some proud miscreant that hath done you any wrong, know that it is my office to help the weak, to revenge the wronged, and to punish traitors. Ransack your memory, and if you find anything of this sort for me to do, you have but to utter it, and I promise you, by the order of knighthood which I have received, to procure your satisfaction to your heart's content." "Sir Knight," replied the inn with equal gravity, "I have no need that your worship should avenge me any wrong, for I know how to take what revenge I think good when an injury is done. All I want is that your worship should pay me the score you have run up this night in mine inn, both for the straw and barley of your 2 beasts, and your suppers, and your beds." "This, then, is an inn?" exclaimed Don Quixote. "Ay, that it is, and a very respectable one too," replied the innkeeper. "All this time, then, I have been deceived," said Don Quixote, "for in truth I thought it was a castle, and no mean one. But since it is indeed an inn, and no castle, all that can be done now is to ask you to forgive me any payment, for I cannot break the laws of knight-errant, of whom I know for certain that they never paid for lodging or aught else in the inns where they stayed. For the good entertainment that is given them is their due reward for the sufferings they endure, seeking adventures both day and night, winter and summer, afoot and a horseback, in thirst and hunger, in heat and cold, being exposed to all the storms of heaven and the hardships of earth." "All that is no business of mine," retorted the innkeeper. "Pay me what you owe me, and keep your tales of knights errant for those who want them. My business is to earn my living." "You are a fool and a saucy fellow," said Don Quixote angrily, and spurring Rocinante and brandishing his lance, he swept out of the inn-yard before anyone could stop him, and rode on a good distance without waiting to see if his squire was following. The innkeeper, when he saw him go without paying, ran up to get his due from Sancho Panza, who also refused to pay, and said to him, "Sir, seeing I am a squire to a knight-errant, the same rule and reason for not paying at inns and taverns hold as good for me as for my master." The innkeeper grew angry at these words, and threatened that if he did not pay speedily, he would get it from him in a way he would not like. Sancho replied that by the order of knighthood, which his lord and master had received, he would not pay a penny, though it cost him his life. But his bad fortune so managed it that there happened to be at the inn at this time 4 wool-combers of Segovia, and 3 needle-makers of Cordova, and 2 neighbours from Seville, all merry fellows, very mischievous and playsome, and as if they were all moved with one idea, they came up to Sancho, and pulling him down off his ass, one of them ran for the innkeeper's blanket, and they flung him into it. But looking up and seeing that the ceiling was somewhat lower than they needed for their business, they determined to go out into the yard, which had no roof but the sky, and there, placing Sancho in the middle of the blanket, they began to toss him aloft and to make sport with him by throwing him up and down. The outcries of the miserable betossed squire were so many and so loud that they reached the ears of his master, who, standing a while to listen what it was, believed that some new adventure was at hand, until he clearly recognized the shrieks to come from poor Sancho. Immediately turning his horse, he rode back at a gallop to the inn gate, and finding it closed, rode round the wall to see if he could find any place at which he might enter. But he scarcely got to the wall of the inn yard, which was not very high, when he beheld the wicked sport they were making with his squire. He saw him go up and down with such grace and agility that, had his anger allowed him, I make no doubt he would have burst with laughter. He tried to climb the wall from his horse, but he was so bruised and broken that he could by no means alight from his saddle, and therefore, from on top of his horse, he used such terrible threats against those that were tossing Sancho that one could not set them down in writing. But in spite of his reproaches, they did not cease from their laughter or labor, nor did the flying Sancho stop his lamentations, mingled now with threats, and now with prayers. Thus they carried on their merry game, until at last from sheer weariness they stopped and let him be. And then they brought him his ass, and, helping him to mount it, wrapped him in his coat. And the kind-hearted Maritornes, seeing him so exhausted, gave him a pitcher of water, which, that it might be the cooler, she fetched from the well. Just as he was going to drink, he heard his master's voice calling to him, saying, "Son Sancho, drink not water, drink it not, my son, for it will kill thee. Behold, here I have that most holy balsam." And he showed him the can of liquor. "2 drops of which thou drinkest, thou wilt undoubtedly be cured." At these words Sancho shuddered, and replied to his master, "You forget surely that I am no knight, or else you do not remember the pains I suffered last evening. Keep your liquor to yourself, and let me be in peace." At the conclusion of this speech he began to drink, but finding it was only water, he would not taste it, and called for wine, which Maritornes very kindly fetched for him, and likewise paid for it out of her own purse. As soon as Sancho had finished drinking, he stuck his heels into his ass, and the inn gate being thrown wide open, he rode out, highly pleased at having paid for nothing, even at the price of a tossing. The innkeeper, however, had kept his wallet, but Sancho was so distracted when he departed that he never missed it. When Sancho reached his master, he was almost too jaded and faint to ride his beast. Don Quixote, seeing him in this plight, said to him, "Now I am certain that yon castle or inn is without doubt enchanted. For those who made sport with thee so cruelly, what else could they be but phantoms and beings of another world? And I am the more sure of this, because when I was by the wall of the inn-yard, I was not able to mount it, or to alight from Rocinante, and therefore I must have been enchanted. For if I could have moved, I would have avenged thee in a way to make those scoundrels remember the jest forever, even although, to do it, I should have had to disobey the rules of knighthood." "So would I also have avenged myself," said Sancho, "knight or no knight, but I could not. And yet I believe that those who amused themselves with me were no phantoms or enchanted beings, but men of flesh and bones as we are, for one was called Pedro, and another Tenorio, and the innkeeper called a third Juan. But what I make out of all this is that those adventures which we go in search of will bring us at last so many misadventures that we shall not know our right foot from our left. And the best thing for us to do, in my humble opinion, is to return us again to our village and look after our own affairs, and not go jumping, as the saying is, out of the frying pan into the fire." "How little dost thou know of knighthood, friend Sancho," replied Don Quixote. "Peace, and have patience, for a day will come when thou shalt see with thine own eyes how fine a thing it is to follow this calling. What pleasure can equal that of winning a battle or triumphing over an enemy?" "I cannot tell," answered Sancho, "but this I know, that since we are knights errant, we have never won any battle, unless it was with that Biscayan, and even then your worship lost half an ear. And ever after that time it has been nothing but cudgels and more cudgels, blows and more blows, I getting the tossing and the blanket to boot, and all this happens to me from enchanted people on whom I cannot take vengeance." "That grieves me," replied Don Quixote, "but who knows what may happen? Fortune may bring me a sword like that of Amadis, which did not only cut like a razor, but there was no armour, however strong or enchanted, which could stand before it." "It will be my luck," said Sancho, "that when your worship finds such a sword, it will, like the balsam, be of use only to those who are knights, whilst poor squires will still have to sup sorrow." "Fear not that, Sancho," replied his master, and he rode ahead, his mind full of adventures, followed at a little distance by his unhappy squire. Chapter 10 of the Adventure of the Two Armies. Whilst they were riding on their way, Don Quixote saw a large, dense cloud of dust rolling towards them, and turning to Sancho, said, "This is the day on which shall be shown the might of my arm, and on which I am to do deeds which shall be written in the books of fame. Dost thou see the dust which arises there? Know then that it is caused by a mighty army, composed of various and numberless nations that are marching this way." "If that be so," replied Sancho, "then must there be two armies, for on this other side there is as great a dust." Don Quixote turned round to behold it, and seeing that it was so, he was marvellous glad, for he imagined that there were indeed two armies coming to fight each other in the midst of that spacious plain. For at every hour and moment his fancy was full of battles, enchantments, and adventures, such as are related in the books of knighthood, and all his thoughts and wishes were turned towards such things. As for the clouds he had seen, they were raised by two large flocks of sheep, which were being driven along the same road from two opposite sides, and this, by reason of the dust, could not be seen until they came near. Don Quixote was so much in earnest when he called them armies that Sancho at once believed it, asking, "What then shall we do, good master?" "What?" cried Don Quixote. "Why, favor and help those who are in distress and need. Thou must know, Sancho, that this comes on our front is led by the mighty Emperor Alifanfaron, lord of the great island of Trapobana. This other which is marching at our back is the army of his foe, the king of the Garamantes, Pentapolin of the naked arm, for he always goes into battle with his right arm bare." "But why do these two princes hate each other so much?" asked Sancho. "They are enemies," replied Don Quixote, "because Alifanfaron is a furious pagan and is deeply in love with Pentapolin's daughter, who is a beautiful and gracious princess and a Christian. Her father refuses to give her to the pagan king until he abandons Mohammed's false religion and becomes a convert to his own." "By my beard," said Sancho, "Pentapolin does right well, and I will help him all I can." "Then thou wilt but do thy duty," said Don Quixote, "for it is not necessary to be dubbed a knight to engage in battles such as these." "Right," replied Sancho, "but where shall we stow this ass, that we may be sure of finding him after the fight is over? For I think it is not the custom to enter battle mounted on such a beast." "That is true," said Don Quixote, "but thou mayest safely leave it to chance whether he be lost or found, for after this battle we shall have so many horses that even Rocinante runs a risk of being changed for another. And now let us withdraw to that hillock yonder, that we may get a better view of both those great armies." They did so, and standing on the top of a hill, gazed at the two great clouds of dust, which the imagination of Don Quixote had turned into armies. And then Don Quixote, with all the eloquence he could muster, described to Sancho the names of the different knights in the two armies, with their colors and devices and mottos, and the number of their squadrons, and the countries and provinces from which they came. But though Sancho stood and listened in wonder, he could see nothing as yet of knights or armies, and at last he cried out, "Where are all these grand knights, good my master? For myself, I can see none of them, but perhaps it is all enchantment, as so many things have been." "How? Sayest thou so?" said Don Quixote. "Dost thou not hear the horses neigh, and the trumpets sound, and the noise of the drums?" "I hear nothing else," said Sancho, "but the great bleating of sheep." And so it was, indeed, for by this time the two flocks were approaching very near to them. "The fear thou art in," said Don Quixote, "permits thee neither to see nor hear aright, for one of the effects of fear is to disturb the senses, and make things seem different from what they are. If thou art afraid, stand to one side, and leave me to myself, for I alone can give the victory to the side which I assist." So saying, he clapped spurs to Rocinante, and setting his lance in rest, rode down the hillside like a thunderbolt. Sancho shouted after him as loud as he could, "Return! Good Sir Don Quixote, return! For verily all those you go to charge are but sheep and muttons. Return, I say! Alas that I ever was born! What madness is this? Look, there are neither knights, nor arms, nor shields, nor soldiers, nor emperors, but only sheep. What is it you do? Wretch that I am!" For all this, Don Quixote did not turn back, but rode on, shouting in a loud voice, "So ho, knights! Ye that serve and fight under the banner of Pentapolin of the naked arm, follow me, all of you. Ye shall see how easily I will revenge him on his enemy Alifanfaron of Trapobana." With these words he dashed into the midst of the flock of sheep, and began to spear them with as much courage and fury as if he were fighting his mortal enemies. The shepherds that came with the flock cried to him to leave off, but seeing their words had no effect, they unloosed their slings and began to salute his pate with stones as big as one's fist. But Don Quixote made no account of their stones, and galloping to and fro everywhere cried out, "Where art thou, proud Alifanfaron? Where art thou? Come to me, for I am but one knight alone, who desires to prove my strength with thee, man to man, and make thee yield thy life for the wrong thou hast done to the valorous Pentapolin." At that instant a stone gave him such a blow that it buried 2 of his ribs in his body. Finding himself so ill-treated, he thought for certain that he was killed or sorely wounded, and recollecting his balsam, he drew out his oil pot and set it to his mouth to drink. But before he could take as much as he wanted, another stone struck him full on the hand, broke the oil pot into pieces, and carried away with it 3 or 4 teeth and grinders out of his mouth, and sorely crushed 2 fingers of his hand. So badly was he wounded by these 2 blows that he now fell off his horse onto the ground. The shepherds ran up, and believing that they had killed him, they collected their flocks in great haste, and carrying away their dead muttons, of which there were 7, they went away without caring to inquire into things any further. Sancho was all this time standing on the hill, looking at the mad pranks his master was performing, and tearing his beard, and cursing the hour when they had first met. Seeing, however, that he was fallen on the ground, and the shepherds had gone away, he came down the hill, and went up to his master, and found him in a very bad way, although not quite insensible. "Did I not tell you, Sir Don Quixote," said Sancho mournfully, "did I not tell you to come back? For those you went to attack were not armies, but sheep." "That thief of an enchanter, my enemy, can alter things and make men vanish away as he pleases. Know, Sancho, that it is very easy for those kind of men to make us seem what they please, and this malicious being who persecutes me, envious of the glory that I was to reap from this battle, hath changed the squadrons of the foe into flocks of sheep. If thou dost not believe me, Sancho, get on thine ass, and follow them fair and softly, and thou shalt see that when they have gone a little way off, they will return to their original shapes, and ceasing to be sheep, become men as right and straight as I painted them to you at first." At this moment, the balsam that Don Quixote had swallowed began to make him very sick, and Sancho Panza ran off to search in his wallet for something that might cure him. But when he found that his wallet was not upon his ass, and remembered for the first time that it was left at the inn, he was on the point of losing his wits. He cursed himself anew, and resolved in his heart to leave his master and return to his house, even though he should lose his wages and the government of the promised island. Don Quixote had now risen, and with his left hand to his mouth, that the rest of his teeth might not fall out, with the other he took Rozinante by the bridle, and went up to where his squire stood leaning against his ass, with his head in his hand, looking the picture of misery. Don Quixote, seeing him look so miserable, said to him, "Learn, Sancho, not to be so easily downcast, for these storms that befall us are signs that the weather will soon be fair. Therefore thou shouldst not vex thyself about my misfortunes, for sure thou dost not share in them." "How not?" replied Sancho. Mayhap he they tossed in a blanket yesterday was not my father's son? And the wallet which is missing today with all my chattels, is not that my misfortune?" "What? Is the wallet missing, Sancho?" said Don Quixote. "Yes, it is missing," answered Sancho. "In that case, we have nothing to eat today," said Don Quixote. "It would be so," said Sancho, "should the herbs of the field fail us, which your worship says you know of, and with which you have told me knights-errant must supply their wants." "Nevertheless," answered Don Quixote, "I would rather just now have a hunch of bread, or a cottage loaf and a couple of pilchards' heads, than all the herbs that Dioscorides has described. But before thou mountest thine ass, lend me here thy hand, and see how many teeth and grinders are lacking on this right side of my upper jaw, for there I feel the pain." Sancho put his fingers in, and feeling about, asked, "How many grinders did your worship have before, on this side?" "4," replied Don Quixote, "besides the wisdom tooth, all whole and sound." "Mind well what you say, sir," answered Sancho. "4, say I, if not 5," said Don Quixote, "for in all my life I never had tooth or grinder drawn from my mouth, nor has any fallen out, or been destroyed by decay." "Well then, in this lower part," said Sancho, "your worship has but 2 grinders and a half, and in the upper neither a half nor any, for all is as smooth as the palm of my hand." "Unfortunate I!" exclaimed Don Quixote, "for I would rather they had deprived me of my arm, as long as it were not my sword arm. No, Sancho, that a mouth without grinders is like a mill without a grindstone, and a tooth is more to be prized than a millstone. But all this we must suffer who profess the stern rule of knights errant. Mount, friend, and lead the way, for I will follow thee what pace thou pleasest." Chapter 11. Of a wonderful adventure which Don Quixote went through without peril to himself or Sancho. "Methinks, my master," said Sancho, "that all the mishaps that have befallen us in these days are without doubt in punishment for the sin you committed against the rules of knighthood, in not keeping your vow, which you made, not to eat bread, and all the other things you vowed to do, until you got the helmet of Malandrino, or whatever his name was." "Thou art very right, Sancho," said Don Quixote, "but to tell the truth, it had passed from my memory. But I will make amends as may be done by the rules of knighthood." "And doubtless," replied Sancho, "all will then be well, and I shall live to see none so great as Don Quixote of the Mancha, the knight of the rueful countenance." "Why did you give me that name, good Sancho?" asked his master. "Because truly," replied his squire, "your worship has now the most ill-favoured face that any man ever saw, and it must be, I think, because you are tired out after the battle, or on account of the loss of your grinders." "I fancy," said Don Quixote, "that some sage must have put it into thy head to give me such a name, for now I remember that all knights took a name of that kind, and there was the Knight of the Flaming Sword, and the Knight of the Griffin, and many another. And from this day forward I shall call myself by no other name than the Knight of the Rueful Countenance. And that the name may become me better, I will upon the first occasion cause to be painted on my shield a most ill-favoured and sorrowful face." "There is no need," said Sancho, "to waste time and money in having the countenance painted. All that has to be done is that your worship should discover your own, and show your face to those that look at you, when, without doubt, they will name you he of the rueful countenance. Hunger and the loss of teeth have given your worship so evil a face that you may spare yourself the painting." Don Quixote laughed at his squire's pleasantry, but determined nevertheless to have the painting made on his shield according to his fancy. They had now arrived at a wide but hidden valley between 2 mountains, where they alighted, and seeing a meadow on the side of the hill thick with green and tender grass, they entered it and marched along, feeling their way, for the night was so dark they could not see a jot. They had scarcely gone 200 paces when they heard a great noise of water, as if it fell headlong from some great and steep rock, and being by this time very thirsty, the sound cheered them greatly. Stopping to listen whence it came, they heard another loud noise, which drowned all their joy, especially Sancho's, who, as I have said, was by nature timid and easily frightened. They heard, I say, certain blows, louder than the sound of the rushing water, and struck in regular beats, accompanied by the ugly sounds of rattling irons and chains. These, with the furious sounds of the water and the surrounding darkness, were enough to strike terror into any heart less brave than Don Quixote's. The night, as I said, was dark, and they were now among some tall trees, whose leaves, moved by a gentle breeze, made a low whispering sound, so that the loneliness of the place, the darkness, the noise of the water, the strange sounds of the heavy beating and rattling chains, all caused horror and fright, the more so when they found that the blows never ceased, and morning seemed as though it would never come. But Don Quixote was not disturbed by these things, and leaping on Rocinante, he seized his shield, brandished his lance, and said, "Friend Sancho, I am he for whom are reserved all dangerous, great, and valorous feats. I am he who shall cause the fears of the knights of the Round Table to be forgotten. Mark well, trusty and loyal squire, the darkness of this night, the strange stillness, the dull, confused trembling of the leaves, the dreadful noise of the water, which seems as though it were leaping down from the steep mountains of the moon, the constant thumping of the blows which wounds and pains our ears, which all together, and each by itself, are enough to strike terror, fear, and amazement into the mind of Mars. How much more in his that is not accustomed to such adventures? But with me it causeth my heart to almost burst in my bosom with joy to try this peril, however great it may be. Therefore, tighten Rocinante's girths a little, and may all be well with thee. Wait for me here 3 days, and no more, and if I do not return in the end of that time, go back to our village, and from thence, for my sake, to Toboso, where thou shalt say to my incomparable Lady Dulcinea that her captive knight died attempting things that might make him worthy to be called hers." When Sancho heard his master say these things, he began to weep piteously, and said to him, "Sir, I see no reason why you should undertake this fearful adventure. It is now night. There is no one sees us. We can easily turn aside and go away from the danger, and since no one sees us, no one can set us down as cowards. Remember that I left my country, my wife, and children to come and serve you, and to obtain that unlucky and accursed island you have promised me so often, and now you mean to forsake me here in this desert. Put it off at least until the morning, for it can want but little from this to daybreak." "Let it want what it may," answered Don Quixote. "It shall never be said of me that tears or prayers hindered my doing my duty as a knight." Sancho, seeing that his master's mind was made up, and that his tears, entreaties, and prayers were of no avail, determined to use his wits, and see if by trickery he could make him wait until daybreak. And so, when he was tightening the horse's girths, he softly, and without being felt, tied his ass's halter to both Rocinante's legs, so fast that when Don Quixote thought to depart, he could not, for his horse was not able to go a step except by little jumps. Sancho, seeing the success of this trick, exclaimed, "Behold, sir, how heaven, moved by my tears and prayers, has ruled that Rocinante shall not be able to go a step, and if you persist in urging, spurring, and striking him, it will be to anger fortune, and kick, as the saying is, against the pricks." Don Quixote grew angry at this, and yet the more he spurred Rocinante, the less would he move. But at last he became convinced that it was no further use attempting to make him go, and resolved to remain quiet until the morning came, or until Rocinante would please to depart. And having no idea that Sancho was the cause of this, he said to him, "Since it is so, Sancho, that Rocinante is not able to move, I am content to wait here until morning smiles, although I weep to think it may be so long in coming." "You shall have no cause to weep," replied Sancho, "for I will tell you stories from now till daylight, unless you would like to dismount and snatch a little sleep upon the green grass, after the custom of knights errant, that you may be the fresher the morrow to finish this terrible adventure." "Who talks of sleeping?" said Don Quixote angrily. "Am I one of those knights that repose in time of danger? Sleep thou, who wast born to sleep, or do what thou please, for I shall do what I think right." "Good sir, be not angry," said Sancho, "for I did not mean that." And coming as near to his master as he durst, he placed one hand on the pommel of his saddle and crept as near as he could, so great was the fear he had of those blows, which all the while did sound without ceasing. After many hours spent in conversation, the dawn approached, and Sancho, seeing this, unloosed Rocinante very carefully. As soon as the horse felt himself free, though he was never very mettlesome, he began to paw with his hoofs, and Don Quixote, noticing that he moved, took it for a sign, and believed that it was now time to attempt this fearful adventure. And now the sun had risen, and everything appeared distinctly, and Don Quixote saw that he was among some tall chestnut trees that cast a very dark shadow. He perceived that the hammering did not cease, but could not discover what caused it, and so, without delay, he spurred Rocinante, and turning back again to Sancho to bid him farewell, commanded him to stay for him there 3 days at the longest, and that if he returned not then, to take it for certain that he had ended his days in that perilous adventure. He again repeated to him the message which he had to carry to Lady Dulcinea, and assured him that if he came safe out of this dreadful peril, the squire might hold the promised island as more than certain. Here Sancho began to weep afresh at the pitiful words of his good master, and determined not to abandon him until the last end of this adventure. And thereupon Don Quixote rode forward towards the terrible noises, Sancho following him on foot, leading by the halter his good Dapple, who was the constant companion of his good or evil fortune. Having gone a good distance among those chestnuts and shady trees, they came to a little meadow which lay at the foot of some high rocks, down which a mighty rush of water descended. At the foot of the rocks were some houses, so roughly built that they seemed more like ruins than houses, from whence came the din and clatter of the strokes, which still never ceased. Rocinante started at the noise of the water and the hammering, and being made quiet by Don Quixote, drew near little by little to the houses. Don Quixote murmured devoutly the name of his beloved Lady Dulcinea, and Sancho, never apart from his master's side, stretched out his neck and eyes as far as he could, to see if he could make out what it was that caused them so much terror and dismay. And when they had gone about another 100 paces, they turned a corner, and there before their eyes was the cause of that hideous and terrible noise that had kept them all the night so miserable and frightened. This was nothing worse than a mill for fulling cloth, whose 6 great iron maces or pestles, driven by the water wheels, kept on day and night, falling and rising from their troughs with successive hammering blows. And this had caused the terrible noise which had so terrified the adventurers. When Don Quixote saw what it was, he stood mute and ashamed. Sancho beheld him, and saw that he hung his head on his breast. Don Quixote looked also at his squire, and saw that his cheeks were swollen with laughter, with evident signs that he was in danger of bursting. Don Quixote's melancholy was not so great that he could help smiling a little, or seeing Sancho, and Sancho, when he saw his master beginning to laugh, burst out loud and long, with such force that he had to put his hands to his sides to prevent them from splitting. 4 times he ended, and 4 times he started again, but what chiefly enraged Don Quixote was that he began to repeat in a jesting manner, imitating his master, "Friend Sancho, I am he for whom are reserved all dangerous, great, and valorous feats." And he went on repeating the greater part of what Don Quixote had said when they first heard the fearsome sounds. This was more than Don Quixote could bear, and lifting up the end of his lance, he gave him 2 such blows on the back that if he had caught them on his pate, they would have freed his master from paying him any more wages. Sancho, seeing that he had carried the jest too far, said very humbly, "Please, good master, I did but jest." But why dost thou jest? I tell thee, I do not jest, replied Don Quixote. Come here, master merryman, and tell me, am I, being as I am a knight, to distinguish noises, and to know which are those of mills and which are of giants? Turn me those 6 hammers into giants, and cast them at me, one by one, or all together. And if I do not turn all their heels up, then mock me as much as thou pleasest. No more, good sir, said Sancho, for I confess I have been somewhat too laughsome. But henceforth you may be sure that I will not once unfold my lips to jest at your doings, but only to honour you as my master and lord. By doing so thou shalt live on the face of the earth, for next to our parents we are bound to respect our masters as if they were our fathers.